Hi, everyone, and welcome to the And Then There Was Only One panel where we'll be discussing fan fiction and tropes. Before we get started, this is CoNZealand Fringe, which has been created as a complementary programming series to the annual science fiction convention Worldcon. All our live streams take place outside core CoNZealand programming and are not official CoNZealand programming items. CoNZealand Fringe is not endorsed by CoNZealand. So today, like I said, we will be discussing fan fiction, tropes, and everything in between. I am joined by some lovely panelists who will introduce themselves. So we're going to go through and introduce ourselves and talk about how we got introduced to fandom. So hi, I'm Sam from Thoughts on Tomes, the YouTube channel you're currently on, and I am a booktuber talking about mostly science fiction and fantasy on my channel. And my introduction to fandom was probably with the Buffy the Vampire Slayer fandom. Back in middle school. And it was a fandom of two because my best friend and I at the time didn't know that fandom existed online because we were little and we had no idea. So it was just us writing quotes on our binders and trying to get memorabilia and watching the show on VHS.
So I'm Brent Lambert. I'm the social media manager and reviews editor for Fire Literary Magazine. We were up for Hugo this year for Best Semi-Pro Magazine. My introduction to fandom was X-Men. So I decided to wear a shirt for it. So funny story, as a kid, I hated reading. I didn't want to read and until my dad bought me some X-Men comics and I fell in love and I just lost my way in that fandom and I've been in it ever since.
So I'm Iona, Iona Datt Sharma. I'm a writer. I live in London. I was in fandom from about 2001, I think. I got really into Stargate SG-1, the original one, not the one with all the weird tropes that we'll come to. I was also like a fandom of I think 3 or 4 before discovering it on the internet. But yeah, I was the sort of like 13-year-old fan who was on Yahoo groups a lot.
And I'm Elizabeth Minkel. I'm a fan culture journalist, and I am the co-host of Fansplaining, a podcast, and the co-curator of the Rec Center newsletter, which was also a finalist. Oh, we didn't win for Hugo this year. And my first fandom that I learned about was also Buffy in 1998 when I was in 8th grade. But I started writing fic long before that, like before I knew it was a thing, which I think is pretty common for anyone my age and up. And I actually discovered fan fiction because I was on a Buffy website in the middle of the night in 1998. And I read this story where Giles became a vampire. And I thought it was like spoilers or predictions for the next season. And I was like traumatized. And I called my friend and I was like, I don't. And she was like, I think you read fan fiction. And I was like, I don't know what that is. But I had actually been writing it for years at that point for other stuff that I was into before that. And that's when it all started to come together. So, and I've been there ever since.
Awesome. So the first question that we should probably just get out of the way is, what are all of your favorite tropes? And this can be both within canon and within fan fiction.
Ooh, for me, I love crossovers. Like I've always been a huge fan of crossovers. The weirder, the better. Like I've always been into it. Like I think Batman Ninja Turtles I saw at one point, or Batman versus Jack the Ripper, or like X-Men and Star Trek. I love stuff like that because I just like seeing these two disparate properties like coming together. And honestly, it's probably how I write my own stuff. I just smash 2 properties together and file off the serial numbers. So it's just kind of like I've always been into that trope.
So I quite like the kind of science fiction-y ones that are along the lines of, sudden telepathy or sudden body swap, or for some mystical reason we have to stay within 100 feet of each other at all times, that kind of thing. And also my favorite one of all time for some reason is I Thought You Were Dead, that one where lots of emotional trauma, but it all comes out brilliantly in the end.
I've always really liked the companion to that, the Everybody Lives, right, where you just like resurrect people. That's one of my favorites. So my absolute favorite is a fan fiction specific one, which is the Canon Divergent AU, which obviously all right, you can do that in non-fic, but it's like, I mean, in things that are not fan fiction. But it's counterfactual history when it's non-fic. But it's something really, I think it's something really integral to fan fiction itself, this kind of idea that the original canon and the story can kind of sit parallel to each other. I really love like looking at those things side by side. I also love all those. I have this like, I feel it's like a very id-like weakness for the like sudden body swap and the like, I used to read, you know, like Harry Draco fic in 2001 where they had the sudden telepathy and they were stuck together, you know, literally stuck together. But I also, I do love all the kind of romancy tropes, like a good fake boyfriend AU or fake dating, that kind of thing. Like that's really solid. If it's done well and it's a ship I love, because I always read and write ships, then I love it. So
do you guys feel like with those favorites that you have, do you feel like there was this one moment that you discovered those favorites? Like you read a fic or you saw something and you were like, that's what I love. That's my new favorite. Or was it just over time, you just saw it over and over again and it became a favorite?
I think it was over time, just because like being in comics, you know, I think for me, the first really big one is like one of the most obvious ones when they did Marvel versus DC.
Mm-hmm.
I was a kid when that came out and like, I was like, what? Superman and Hulk are fighting? Like Thor and Captain Marvel? And I just lost my mind. I was like, this is the most amazing thing ever. And I just love the scope of it. And it kind of translated into the type of scope I liked and stuff that wasn't fanfic, just stories in general. I love crossovers so much. I love stories with big scopes, epicness, and just like, you know, a lot of characters meeting up and whatnot. So I definitely think, it started off with that little seed and it just spread and infected everything I love. So.
Mm-hmm. I think relating to what Elizabeth was saying about canon AU divergence, the one like amazing light bulb moment I had was, you know, I think it was in the early 2000s where the trend was for stories with the title of 5 Things That Never Happened to X. I loved those. They just kind of lit a fire in my head. And I think with those, it was, yes, this is what you can do with Spanish-specific tropes because we all know what really did happen to these people. And the, you know, the kind of bouncing off of that is what I loved. Like, I mean, that I might be still the only person who's obsessed with that trope in this year of our Lord 2020, but I am.
I'll do it. Don't worry. Yeah, I think for me, when I think back, because I'm a bit of a fandom monogamist, so I've been in like 6 fandoms and 5 ships in my 20 years plus, right? Maybe some people are in one fandom their whole lives, so maybe it's not that monogamous. But for me, a lot of it really depends on the specific fandom that I'm in. Like there are some tropes that like would not work for me Harry Potter is very much in the past for me at this point, but like there are a lot of things in the Harry Potter world that I wouldn't engage with elsewhere. I wouldn't engage with there that I would engage with elsewhere, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of like, I'll read any fake relationships stance that a lot of people have, and they'll just read by that trope, and they'll read in any fandom, and they'll just click on the tag on AO3. That's something that I don't really experience because it needs to kind of feel right for the fandom and the relationship for me. I don't have a list, except for canon divergent AU, because I always want to fix. I think all media needs to be fixed.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree to fix it too. Like I love a good fix it because I think like at least I'm probably dating myself, but I used to do fanfic on the AOL boards back in the day, the message board. And so I was part of a lot of like shared universe Marvel fan fiction sites. And that really was like the essence of most of them, was just like, I hated that storyline. Let's start here and do our own thing. And stuff just kind of exploded from there. So yeah, I've always like fix it. I think in comics, it works a lot better too with fixes just because there's so many different people who have the hands in the pot in the canon. So everyone kind of feels like, well, if they could do it, I could do it too. And, you know, so it kind of, I don't know, it's always felt like, it's probably part of the reason I'm a writer too. It's just like, I was like, yeah, I could do that better. Let me try. And it just kind of, you know, kept going from there. So yeah, I love a good fix-it.
Yeah. Do you guys feel like that's where you really got super involved in fandom? I feel like a lot of us found fandom from just like I find a lot of fandom from like fan art. Like that's how I get pulled in initially, and then all of a sudden I'm diving down into everything else. But I get into it that way, and then I'm like, something made me mad about the canon, and then I start looking for, like you said, like fix-its to be like, well, I don't think, I mean, I'm not a fanfic writer myself, but just like, oh, I didn't want it to end that way. Did somebody else make it a different way? Is that how you guys kind of got involved too?
Yes, but I also found a really good AU fic one time, and I read it and I was so blown away. It was such a good story that I started mixing it with canon, and I was like, wait, that's not how it actually happened. Like that was the fic, so it kind of just it was a combination of the two, I guess. I just saw like the power of story when people kind of like got a chance to do their own thing. And part of it was like the spite of like, oh, well, I could do this too. I can fix this. Yeah, especially I think it was like X-Men. They killed a particular character, and I was like really pissed about it. And I was like, I could bring this person back, like, or like we could do this. So yeah. For me, it was definitely I think a spite thing and ambition thing from the beginning.
I think not for me so much. I mean, for me, it's always been a little simpler. I think it's just, I really love the stories about these people. Please, can I have more?
Yeah, that's my experience too. I mean, like me and my semi-monogamy here, it needs to really, it feels like falling, it's the last few times when I've joined a new fandom, it'll be like, I'll watch the thing and I'll be like, oh, fuck. Am I allowed to swear? Is this
yes,
a clean
absolutely.
Right. Fuck. Like, and I remember very distinctly, I was in the Sherlock fandom in like 2013 and 14. I remember very distinctly like watching all of them and then being like, going to AO3 and being like, do I want to do this? And literally feeling like I was on a precipice, right? And then like clicking on like just sorting by real basic, like sorting by kudos and clicking on the first one and then being like, okay, goodbye. And that literally happened the last time I joined a new fandom. It was the same feeling. I had that moment of like, maybe if I don't actually go to AO3, I won't be in this fandom. So, which is very different from a lot of my friends who are much more casually and broadly interested, and they do things like Yuletide, and they just love writing stories about things that catch them, but it doesn't need to be like, feel like oh no, I can't turn back now. I'm trapped here, which is maybe not a positive or whatever.
But now that I'm older, I feel like I'm more like how y'all approach it. Cause like when I was a teenager, of course, teenage boys, we think we can do anything. So, but now that I'm older, like, especially with like the fan art, I see a lot of like, Avatar: The Last Airbender fan art and like, the little coffee shop or AUs with them. And I just enjoy looking at them now. Like, I don't have this idea like, oh, I can do it better. Like, now that I'm a little older and a little more mature, I can just appreciate the work for what it is and just enjoy that people are getting something out of it and they want more of it.
Yeah. On that same note, do you feel like your guys' engagement with fandom has changed over time? And how has that changed for you?
I think for me that has changed really significantly, because I think a part of it is a function of, as Brent says, not being a teenager anymore. Like, you've got like, I had more time in 2000 than I do now. So I think that's part of it. But I also had quite a long break from being financially involved with stuff from about 2015 onwards until about a year ago. And partly it was because I was turning my attention to my pro writing and I just didn't have enough brain space. And partly it was genuinely because nothing had really, fandom as a whole had sort of fallen down a Marvel hole, and I wasn't there. Just it just didn't. Nothing against it. It was just it wasn't speaking to me very much. And then last year they made a Good Omens miniseries, and it seems like everything that is new, that is old, comes around again new. And it was there for me, and I had a really good time being like, gosh, I'm doing all the things I used to do when I was 14 years old and had more time to do them. And it was a great feeling. It felt like going back in time to a really like a happy, creatively engaged time of life. So, I mean, the answer to your question, I suppose, is no. My engagement with fandom hasn't changed over time.
That's funny. In podcasts, we've heard from multiple people who have had that experience specifically with Good Omens, that they had been like drifting for a few years, and then they were like, "Oh yeah, that's right. That's what I do." So, my story is probably a little bit weird because from like the 90s until 6 years ago, I was a lurker and like a deep lurker. I like never spoke to another person on the internet about being, I just read a ton of fic and I wrote a lot, but I never published it. And it was very, very private for me. And then like 5 or 6 years ago, I started writing about fandom in my journalism, and it became like my whole beat and then like my whole job. And so that's been I'm very weird in that way, because obviously it's changed massively because I have very public as a fan and speaking on it professionally. So I had to kind of carve out that space for the actual fandom stuff to be mine again. So like I have a suit and it's private and I don't connect the names at all. And it's just something that I do over here with my emotions. And then I can talk about it less emotionally, though still pretty emotionally as a professional. So, but that's not a very ordinary experience probably.
I mean, I think I can relate to the lurking thing a little bit, just because now they're like trying. Yeah, that for sure, right? Yeah, especially because now that I'm trying to be more of a pro writer, I feel like I don't have as much time to engage, because I had to admit to myself at one point that I was using fic as a crutch to not want to dive into being a pro writer, just because with fic you have that built-in community that, when you find the right community, it's very warm and open, and it feels like family. And trying to be a pro writer sometimes it's kind of rough, because it's like, I don't know if these people are going to like my story. They may hate it, like, or they may not even care. That's sometimes even worse. So I think, I think that's how a big way my relationship has changed, just because now it's like my pursuits are different. So I just kind of have to like observe, and I can't really engage with it as much.
You should just create an alter ego, as I have. Make some secret friends. It's like it's 2002 all over again. So.
Right.
So speaking of, like older fandom versus current fandom, do you guys feel like you've seen a shift in how the fandom is with people that maybe grew up with like the very beginning of the internet versus people that have grown up with the internet their whole lives, and how the two groups engage in fandom, without being disparaging to either? Like, is there a shift that you've seen and noticed throughout your time in fandom?
So I have a rant about this that I bring out every time, which is in 2000 and 2001, I was young as fans went. Like, there were a lot of fans who were, 10, 20, 30 years older than me, and very welcoming. Like, I found it it was the first time I think I'd really socialized with, people who were genuinely not at all in my peer group. Then I think fandom moved a lot from Yahoo to LiveJournal to Dreamwidth to Tumblr to Twitter to Discord, and now I'm old for being in fandom, and I've never had like a fanish adolescence. I've been like, I was either far too young, and now at the age of 33 I'm far too old. I was never actually with it as a fan, and I'm bitter about it. That's it. I'm done.
It's fine. I mean, I feel like I could talk about this for an hour, so I don't know what the most efficient way to give one answer is. I mean, one thing that I like to highlight when I talk about this topic is I don't necessarily think it's about the real age of fans. I talk about newer versus older fans, right? Because I know of people who are, I was going to say my age or even older. I'm 35, so it's like, kind of a medium age. But, I know people who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s who've come to fandom within the last few years. And they're obviously going to have really different frames of reference because of the platforms that they're on and because of the way the platforms shape engagement. But one of the biggest things that I would say is I think there's a big shift from calling back to like the beginning of this conversation, like, do you join fandom, like capital F or whatever, because you really love a show or a book or whatever? Or is it just a broader thing that you're a part of and a lens through which you see media, right? And I think you see a lot more of the latter now, because on Tumblr, people will list their 19 fandoms, and they'll read by trope first instead of reading, they'll read every fake dating AU, right? And they're just like, oh, I like that and that and that. And I think that the platforms really dictate that behavior. And so for a lot of people who've come in the last 10 years, that is a way that they see that's the way that they see fandom and what it is. Obviously, that's like a big generalization, but that's one of the biggest shifts that I think I've seen in the last 25 years.
I think that's a good point though, because the platforms really do kind of like make the difference. I'm jealous of the new fans because they have so much more like discoverability. I feel like as opposed to like back in AOL days or whatnot. I feel like with the platforms today, like younger fans, they just have this ability to find their people so much faster. It's like I can find my people and find the community that is going to lift me up and have the same interests and thoughts and ideas that I have. And I personally think that's such a powerful thing for young fans. And like, I have always told myself I refuse to be a get off my lawn kind of person. So I love it for them. I definitely wish I had it when I was like their age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you were talking, I was kind of thinking about how fandom has become, even though it's still like a separate thing necessarily from mainstream, I still feel like there's a certain level of mainstreamness to it now, where people, especially younger folks, even if they aren't involved in fandom, know about it. Like people know a lot about a lot of the terminology, like what shipping means. A lot of people know that, and they know what like fan art is and all that kind of stuff. So how do you feel like that has also changed things and just like the fact that a lot of our really big fandoms are actually in more of the limelight? Like I'm thinking of like the Reylo Star Wars situation where like major news organizations like knew about Reylos. Like how do you think that's affected what the mainstream thinks about fandom?
That's a huge question.
Yeah.
I can write you a book on that one.
Yeah. You go ahead, Elizabeth. No, you go ahead.
I'm trying to think of just one thing to say about this. I mean, as a journalist, one of the biggest observations of the last 5 years has, I think, been a sort of collapsing of this kind of idea of fandom versus geek media properties. I've been on panels at San Diego Comic-Con every year until this year, IRL only, and it's like you go there and it's just like they seem very confused about like what fans and fandom is, and they're just like, hey, you'll love this, dig it, and you're like, I don't know if I'm gonna love that. Like, I don't think it's necessarily about specific. Obviously, tons of people in fandom are into certain kinds of genres or certain types of stories or whatever, but I don't think it's as straightforward as that. And so I think that that's led in the media to a kind of just a really muddling of ideas of what fans are as opposed to what different genres are, and they don't often have a good grasp on what behaviors are, and they will just see it from the outside. So they'll be like, oh, fans are people who like draw this art. I don't know, and you're like, and maybe we can run a contest and get them to do the art for us and we'll pay them a small amount of money, like it's that little bit of knowledge, and then watching either whether it's Hollywood or the mainstream media kind of spiral off with it in ways that don't really match what fans actually do and think. And then it's frustrating for me to watch, because at a certain point, if the most powerful people are saying it, then isn't that actually the new definition? So like we did a big, my podcast did a big, sorry, I'm talking too much. we did a big survey. God, was it this year? No, it must have been last. Time has collapsed. What the definition of shipping was, because I got an argument with a journalist who wasn't in fandom, where he insisted that his definition was correct, and he wasn't a person who shipped or was involved in shipping. And out of spite, I did a giant survey to get the definitions from fans. And I think at a certain point, it's like, well, maybe his definition is right too, because if you say it enough, and so it kind of feels like fans are losing their own narrative of what their history is if people with more power are dictating what it is. So,
yeah, no, absolutely. That's all true. I live in San Diego, so I'm like in the epicenter of this every year when it happens, and it never fails. I mention anything about being a fan of something, and the first question they ask is, "Oh, are you going to dress up?" I'm like, cosplay is its own community, its own values, and a whole setup. It's like I'm not just going to jump into that, So I think the mainstream, from the outside looking in, they don't understand that there is multiple cultural setups within fandom, and we do different things for different reasons, and I mean, it is kind of a shame, but I do like people like Elizabeth are out there fighting that narrative and pushing back against it, so yeah, I love the fact that we have people out there like you who are fighting for fandom and saying no, you're not going to pigeonhole us into this one thing, and Yeah, I do think it's a double-edged sword, right? Like, it's great that we're getting this exposure, but it's like you're trying to take away our voice at the same time. And I've even seen it somewhat in publishing a little bit. It's been good and weird, but I've seen publishers start using like fanfic hashtags for like new projects coming out. I was like, that's cool. But at the same time, like, I'm a little uncomfortable with it. Like, I don't know how to feel about it. So it's just, yeah, to Elizabeth's point, I do feel like it's a good thing, but at the same time, you just gotta make sure you keep your power as people start to recognize you.
And I think there's one thing jumping off from both of those points, that one thing I have noticed as fandom becomes more quote unquote mainstream is that there's a particular like fanish type of storytelling, which, you know, is the trope thing, really, because we make use of tropes in if you call fanfic a literary tradition, it makes use of tropes in a way that other literary traditions maybe don't. And I think that in itself becoming a bit more mainstream is something I quite like, because there was that lovely book I think it was a couple of years ago, Red, White and Royal Blue, the Casey Christen novel, which I thought was really great. It was what was it? It was the son of the fictional female president of the US falls in love with the Crown Prince, the British Crown Prince, and it's all very overblown and romantic and trophy, and it was a delight. And the other one that comes to mind is a friend of mine has a book coming out soon called Winter's Orbit, that began life as a long piece of like tropey original fic on the AO3. It was in space, and it was like fake space husbands. It was called A Course of Honor when it was on the AO3, and that was great. And I really like that story, which like is really designed to appeal to the fanish mind, which is it's we know that you are going to love space husbands. That's all we have to say to pitch this book. And I really like that, because it puts some kind of not that we need it precisely, but it puts some kind of mainstream recognition that there is such a thing as the fanish literary tradition, and it does have value arising from what it is and not what it is not. But yeah, I guess that's the flip side to the idea of people with more power dictating how mainstream media engages with fandom. Like, not to take away from that point, but you know, I think this is one of the minor compensations.
Well, just to get like a little deeper with what you're saying too, I just thought of something that was sort of a mini controversy that came up not too long ago. So there was a book recently that came out that was admittedly like FinPo fanfic with the serial numbers ripped off or whatever, right? Now, in a fanfic space, I wouldn't begrudge, you know, like a white woman or anyone writing that story. But in a pro-paid space, the questions become different. It's like, are you the person to write a queer black and brown pairing as a white woman and get paid for it? So it's like, you know, you gotta be careful with like some of this translation of fandom to pro, because like you can't disregard the gatekeeping and the barriers that come into a pro setting where that may not exist in the fic setting. Like, so absolutely. I think there's challenges with that. You know, it's like, I mean, I don't know the right answer. I just know it is probably something that will come up more, and stuff, you know, considerations will have to be taken. And yeah, I don't know exactly where I was going with that, but I just know, I think power dynamics, that's really where I was going with it. Just think of, we got to think about that from fanfic, and as it becomes more mainstream and people actually start getting paid for it, you have to examine those marginalizations and whatnot.
Yeah, I absolutely think, I mean, one of the things, you know, from coming off of, I totally agree with what you're saying, and I have ambivalence about it in the sense of like, and to Brent, to bring in your point too, like there's something very valuable to me about fan fiction as a non-monetized, as a gift economy space, as it always has been, right? And fan fiction is the only fan work that doesn't have a now normalized path to monetization, right? And so there is a question of like, well, what does get through? What gets pulled to publish? What gets serial numbers filed off? You have to exactly take those things into account. Like, it's not, there can always be more FinPo. in the world. And
Right.
obviously there are some people in fandom who would say like, well, you shouldn't be writing about characters who don't have to share the same background as you. And that's a totally fair conversation to have. But there is unlimited space to write the free fiction
Right.
and put it on the free internet, you know?
Right.
But when you make that leap, it's like, well, who gets to have the one spot where you get paid for it, right? And like,
Right.
I think that's a really uneasy transition, and you're already, you know, and you're already dealing with, and then it's like, well, what fic even gets to make that leap too? It's not going to be the, you know, is it going to be the super weird stuff? Is it going to be the challenging stuff, or is it going to be the accessible, fun, the broadest thing that you can find, right? So I think it's really thorny, you know?
Yeah, no, it is. It's so thorny. And I mean, like, I struggle with it. I struggle with that particular controversy just because it was like, I can't begrudge the author, like, having put in that time and effort and obvious love into the story. But as a Black gay man trying to, like, make his way as a professional writer, it's still kind of stings to see it happen, because it's like, well, damn, like, maybe I wanted to write the first Black gay, you know, space story with them falling in love. So it's just, it is thorny, and it's very, like, again, I don't have the right answer. I don't know the right answer. It's just like, I think it's just going to be a continued conversation that's probably going to keep happening. That's to Elizabeth's point too. Is like, what fics do make it to make that leap? Like, would a Storm Falcon fanfic be able to make that leap because it's two Black characters? Would it get there? Or, like, you know, or would two non-binary characters being in a relationship be able to make that leap to a professional monetized format? So it's thorny, and, you know, it's going to take a continued discussion. Like, discussions we're having right now, I think, are healthy, and, like, you just have to continue to really, like, be able to navigate that going forward.
Yeah, when you guys were talking about kind of where fanfic and publishing collide, that also got me thinking about authors that are traditionally published that have a history of fan fiction. And when the mainstream fandom of the canon works finds out about the fan fiction, and if they're not familiar with how fan fiction works, the potential backlash that ends up happening, because they don't realize that things that are explored in fanfic can be very different and have different rules. You know, there's a lot of people that explore their trauma in fan fiction, where it's not as explored. I mean, it can be explored in traditional, but it's in a different way. And I think it's been interesting to see how the mainstream will kind of react oftentimes negatively to a fan fiction background, even though, like Iona was saying, it's like a literary tradition, fan fiction at this point. I loved how you said that, but it's still not given the same kind of weight as a lot of traditional publishing stuff is.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see the evolution of that over the last 5 years has been really wild to me, because, you know, coming out of the Harry Potter world, there are some very famous genre writers in a few different genres who were very well-known fic writers. And obviously some of them haven't, like, you know, burned all the bridges behind them, but some have. Some have been like, because, you know, there's that kind of tall poppy syndrome, and you really saw this in the early 2010s of writers trying to make that leap, and people saying, how dare you rise above your station, we're all in fandom together, right? And, you know, you saw those same conversations within the Twilight fandom when E.L. James was writing the original of 50 Shades of Grey, saying, you know, how dare you, we're a community. And she was saying, oh, well, I don't see a problem with this, right? And, like, obviously it all worked out for her, so don't worry about it. But but it's been interesting to see, like, what felt like when I started writing about fan fiction, and I was a book journalist before that, so that was kind of my entry in. And it was because of 50 Shades of Grey that I started writing about fan fiction in the mainstream press, because everyone did such a bad job in the mainstream book press talking about it. And I was just like to fix it. I was like, I'm fixing this. But it's been interesting in the last 5 years as more and more people have come out of the fan fiction side of fandom and into the prose space to see exactly what you're talking about. It's not necessarily having participated in fandom, but it is kind of a judgment on the particular kinds of things people may have done in fandom 10, 15, 20 years ago, decontextualizing it and saying, you know, I don't approve of that kind of stuff, right? And it just feels like it's a kind of a weird shift to pinpoint exactly how that tone of that conversation has changed, but it feels like a continuation of that conversation that's been happening all along with this stuff. So,
yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think I have a story actually where it kind of, like, scared me at first to own up to having, like, being a fanfic writer at one point. So I'd say maybe mid 2000s, we had, I was part of a shared universe Marvel website, and we had a writer there who actually, he went from writing Fantastic Four on our website to being the artist of a new Silver Surfer miniseries at Marvel. Now, at the time, we all knew it was him, and we all were celebrating it, and so it spread. But he ended up losing his job because of it. He was let go off of the comic because at that time, fanfic was regarded as this like, it's like Mufasa talking to Simba, do not go where the light doesn't touch, you know? So, and I think that's how people regarded fanfic. So when I saw that as like I think I was in my 20s, I was like, oh my God, if I ever want to be a professional writer, I'm gonna have to like change my name or something. But you know, I mean, I decided not to anyway, obviously, but I think that concern isn't necessarily there anymore for writers today. They can openly and proudly talk about like, oh, I wrote fanfic. Oh yeah, I ship this, or you know, like, I mean, it's still some thorny areas for sure, and I think we got to be careful. I've seen a couple of things happen in, I think, like young adult Twitter where authors have expressed liking a ship, and then it become this huge shit storm where people are applying them liking a ship to their moral character and who they are as a person. And personally, I think it's bullshit. And I was like not happy to see that happen, but I think it is something that authors have to be careful of like, dealing with in the future when it comes to making that transition from fandom to professional writing.
Yeah, it's almost like it's not the fact that they have been in fandom and are in fandom, but then they are now being judged by the, you know, it's like that person's in fandom and so am I, and I don't like the way that they've been doing it, right? Which is that, you know, like, I don't like that ship and that must mean this, which is something they would say to a fellow fan, but those authors now have a much higher, I mean, you see it with people who get mad at BNFs or whatever. I don't know if we're using that term anymore. I still use it, right? But, you know, like well-known fic writers, right? So that still happens there, but this is like even higher because, you know, that's the person who got the publishing deal, and people presume they're now millionaires, which is rarely true.
Rarely true. Good God, like, every time I hear that, I have to like shake friends and family. I'm like, look, I'm not rich. I promise. It's just a magazine. Like, I'm in no way, shape, or form making money.
Yeah, it's been interesting, like I said, to see, and Brent, you talking about kind of like the YA Twitter specifically. It seems like there's people that you start talking in your space, and if you're like raised in fandom, I guess, you're like, oh, well, I'm in my space, and like, this is my fandom space, kind of forgetting that everyone can see it. And then it's like, you get these things where it's like, well, people are taking this out of context and not understanding that like fandom has, like, again, like almost like a different set of rules almost. And I feel like fandom for a long time has gone far deeper in conversations than mainstream has, obviously. Like there's more room for gray area in fandom always than there ever is in canon mainstream fan kind of culture. And people kind of take it, they're like, well, we're all fans and I don't agree with this thing. And you're like, well, fandom is different though. And you don't know all of the rules for fandoms. So you're taking it out of context.
Right. And I just feel like it's so unfair for some of these people that have to deal with that backlash, because it's like they're being robbed of that space. But and at the same time too, I guess, again, power dynamics. It's like, okay, now I have 20,000 followers. I probably should be a little more careful of like what and how I discuss things. But I also have sympathy for him too, because it's like, it sucks you lost that. I know that's probably like something you really love. So yeah, it's hard. I mean, I don't have a right answer for this one either, but
create a secret suit.
I mean, yeah.
I mean, right? Like I'm sure some of these people have also, but then you say whatever you want. So.
Right, true.
So within both the fandom space and within like a canon space, why do you think people are so hard on tropes a lot of times? You know, like tropes a lot of times get almost talked down to as like, oh, well, that's tropey. Why do you think people are so hard on them?
I mean, I think as a fundamental misunderstanding as to how narrative works, but that is just me. I think it's related to the idea that fan fiction is devalued because it's a literary tradition that belongs to women, or, well, let's say non-men rather than women. But it comes from a non-monetized economy. It comes from a subculture that wasn't always, in fact, definitely wasn't as well known as it is now. And I think saying that something's tropey while meaning that it's like what fanfic would do is kind of a dog whistle. Like, it's to say, you know, it's girl stuff. That's my really simplistic answer to that question, but I think that there's a kernel of truth in that.
Yeah, I think though also too, I totally agree. And building on that, like, you know, I think over maybe the last 10 years, we've seen a real rise in like anxiety about plot in pop culture. You know, I felt like it came to a head last year with the release of Civil War around the like spoiler, you know, and it was just like everyone panicking about spoilers, right? And then Marvel took advantage of that and was immediately like, I guess you're gonna have to see it on the first day so you won't get spoiled. And it's like, if these movies can't, if I knew basic plot points, and I mean it's the same thing with like controversy over content warnings, right? You know, if knowing basic plot points ruins a story for me, then maybe the story isn't actually that well told, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I've really noticed this huge rise, and you see this in like people getting angry about various Star Wars plot points or whatever, this rise in like this kind of TV tropification, like this website TV tropes of like thinking like, oh, this is like one of those arcs and I know what's going to come next, and actually I'm mad that I know it because that's predictable, that kind of thing, right? And it's like people are kind of just looking at stories, it's exactly not knowing how narrative works, like looking at it with the very surface of their brain and then getting upset if it doesn't go the way they want, and also getting upset if it goes in a way they find predictable.
Yes.
You know, and so like I think that romance, and I think also a female dominated or mostly non-male dominated space obviously loves tropes when they're done well, because you know that like you can read 1,000 ways to people falling in love and it can all be different and interesting, right? You know?
Yeah.
And it's something that I feel other genres have a pretty hard time with. And that's where the mainstream sits, you know, watching Marvel movies and not knowing how to deal with these plot structures, basically. Mm-hmm. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, all of y'all points are like absolutely spot on. It's just like, yeah, I use, like, I go on TV Tropes sometimes, but I have like a love-hate relationship with that website because I love like how it catalogs everything, but I also hate how it's created this oversimplification of things.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's like, and it makes people smug. It's like, you know,
Yeah.
I go to this website, so I know this is an unseen one, and that's this trope. And it's like, okay, well, this is how story works. Story has these structures, it has these commonalities. That's shared humanity. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. Like we should exalt these tropes, and we should exalt when they're done well, because that means that's someone who has a firm grasp of story. For my money, when I hear someone who embraces tropes, I know that this is someone who was well read. They probably are widely read, and they understand the mechanics of story. Usually the people who fall over themselves and fall into bad trope territory are the jerks who think that they don't have to acknowledge tropes. Like, every time, if I got like $1 for every time I see a guy talk about, I'm going to write a YA with a girl that isn't like other girls, I wouldn't have to work anymore. It's like they don't have this fundamental understanding, and they end up walking right into the wall of the thing that they claim that they're against. So
yeah.
And it's like y'all guys were saying, it's tied into sexism, it's tied into queer antagonism, it's tied into ageism, because it's all young people. We don't, and you know, so it's just it's this fundamental disrespect of most of the time marginalized peoples who, you know, come at this and they're telling their own mythology and they're finding their own acceptance in these stories through these tropes. And yeah, I think tropes are amazing. I think that they're valuable, and if you want to be a good writer, you should be skilled in them and you should be able to appreciate them. But that's just me.
I think from the craft perspective, it really bothers me as a really kind of, it's really tropey. It's such a bullshit criticism of a work, because in a romance, people fall in love, and in detective stories, they find out who the murderer is.
Right.
And that is how life works. Like, if you try to write a story in which that doesn't happen, like, I mean, subversion of tropes is definitely a thing, and I love that. But that requires, like, as you say, Brent, like it requires a really detailed, sophisticated knowledge of how the trope works when you don't subvert it. Like, and if you, the reader, come across that and you're like, yeah, this is really cool. That also comes from a place of knowing how the trope works and having read the 5 previous works that played it straight. So, you know, it winds me up. It's a really terrible criticism.
It's such a terrible criticism. Yeah. Like, I mean, like, I just, like, a metaphor sometimes I use with this is like when people complain about happy endings in romance novels, I'm like, when I hear that, I'm like, okay, so you sound like someone who's complaining about the fact that most pizza has cheese. Like, yeah, some pizzas may not have cheese, but that's like a fundamental element of pizza. Like, so what are you doing? So it's just, I don't know. It's, yeah.
I think that, and that connected back to fic too. You know, what you guys are saying, like, just makes me think about how, like, I think fic, I mean, not every fic writer, but I think fic writers are often extremely confident writers in the broad scheme of writing in a way that I think fic writers often undervalue themselves and say, oh, I'm just playing with someone else's toys and it's not original. You know, that kind of thing. But you have to, I think you do have to have a lot of confidence to be able to take a story, like, you know, either the original story and retell it, or to be able to take these tropes and say, I'm going to do this too, right? Like, I'm going to add my version of this to the world, and I want to do it the best way I can. And you have to not have a lot of anxiety about whether other people have done that before. And so I think there's a reason why they go hand in hand, you know. And it's just like, I don't know, did any of you guys see Hadestown?
I've listened to it. I haven't gotten to see it.
Yeah. Well, now no one can see any musicals. I was lucky enough to be able to see it before Broadway was canceled, and I don't think it's much of a spoiler to say, you know, it's like several myths at once, but Orpheus and Eurydice, and there's a really powerful bit at the end where it kind of just starts over, right? Like, you've listened to the soundtrack, and they're like, "Why do we keep doing this? We know how the story is going to end," and it's like, well, because we have to, right? Like, that's the way humans work. That's the way storytelling works, you know. And then so it's just this kind of, it was an incredibly powerful moment to see, because it was like, that was devastating. And I would watch this all over again and cry all over again. And that's how I feel when I read, and I sign up for a fic and I know it's, you know, it's like someone's like wrecked it to me and said, like, this will make you bawl. And I'm like, yeah, I want to engage in that cycle again. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think these things are all connected. And if that gives people anxiety, it's because I think they don't feel super as comfortable as fans do, and just kind of leaning into this and knowing there are great versions of these things. So, yeah.
I think there's something to be said too, like you guys have all been saying, that really fandom started with mostly marginalized groups. You know, women, non-binary people, queer people started fandom to see themselves within things that they didn't see themselves in canon. So there's this comfort level with tropes. I think tropes are comforting. Like, I do read romance as well, because it's like, you know what's going to happen. It's not scary. And I think there's something with that where, like, well, we want to see ourselves in this too, you know, and we're seeing this in mainstream and in publishing right now too, where it's like, people are like, oh, well, this has been done. It's like, yeah, but that hasn't been done with a Black main character. That hasn't been done by a Black author. So let them do it. You know, let them have that comfort media that you had forever. So I think that's an interesting exploration where, you know, people forget, I think, that fandom didn't, I think people have this idea also, like we've talked about with the mainstream, people think of fandom and they think of like Star Wars and Marvel and like the white straight fanboys. And it's like, no, fandom was marginalized. And you guys are forgetting the history there.
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah. I think, and part of it too is like, I hate the idea that when, you know, people do deride fandom, like for instance with fanfic, I don't care if it's bad written, if it's badly written or great. Like, let people have that joy of just telling a story and getting it out of their soul or whatever. Like, or even like, you know, it's so sad when I hear people say, oh, I don't want to do this because I'm not good at it. If it brings you joy, who gives a shit if you're good at it? Do it. You don't necessarily have to show everybody, but just like, you know, it's, yeah, I just see it all the time. I see it not just in fic, but I see it when people who don't want to sing or don't want to dance or don't want to do these things. I'm like, these are things fundamental to the human experience. Like, you know, just tell it, like, do it and just have joy in it. And I really, it always bothers me when I see that derision of fandom because of quality concerns or whatever. And honestly, that's bullshit too, because there's tons of quality in fandom. There's tons of amazing works. There's stuff I would read over and over again that's for free, and I wish I could pay the person. Like, so, you know, it's just, Yeah, I could go on for days about this, but yeah, I just hate this fundamental. It's so many people that just want to steal joy, and it just bothers me. Like, let people have it.
So we are nearing the end. So I just want to let the chat know, if you want to ask some questions, please put those in there. And while we are collecting questions, I just have one more question from me for the panelists. What is something that you'd like to see more of in fandom moving forward? What is your hope for fandom future? Whether it's more tropes that you'd like to see explored or whatever. What is your dream for the future of the next 5-10 years of fandom?
Wow.
Shoot for the stars.
Oh man.
I think I would like to see fandom continue to be. Fandom, I think, is great often at unusual literary forms that are quite tropey in their way. So, like epistolary fiction, I'm a big fan. Like, I know that Frankenstein is epistolary, but she was a marginalized writer too. But like things like that, the 5 things that didn't happen thing, and like I think you see lots of fanfic that's like, you know, group chats and like here's a fic that is all somebody's Twitter feed. Or I would like to see fandom continue like embracing tropes that concern how the story is told as well as what's in it, because I think that's something you can do in fandom in a way that you can't really do with pro fiction in the same way, because you gotta get somebody on board with it, even if it's really unconventional. Whereas if you're in fandom, you can, like, a friend of mine wrote a story recently that was all the marginalia in like a public health report. Like, the actual text was very dumb, the story was in the comments, and I thought, you know, this is so cool, and you know, you couldn't do it outside of this context. So I want to see fandom just keep embracing that amazing potential that it has.
It's a real positive one. Everything I'm thinking about is super negative. It's terrible.
I have a quick positive one, so I'll let you pick.
Good.
All
right.
So I just hope I hope fandom doesn't lose its way as it becomes more mainstream. I hope it holds on to and remembers its community, its spirit, and, you know, like, it's a space for people that are pushed out of society. And I just hope it doesn't go the way of Pride in a lot of ways and becomes this corporatized event. So that's my hope for them.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, that's got some. Yeah, it's positive. You put a positive.
Yeah. I try to spin it.
Yeah, that's like the positive spin of some of what I'm thinking about. You know, watching fandom be more and more exposed to the mainstream. You know, over the last decade, it does feel like things have. You know, it squeezes out everyone at the margins, right? And it narrows the idea of what a fan can be. If that's dictated from above and from within, because people are eager to have that sort of sheen of mainstream approval. And I don't like that. So I hope that it doesn't continue to go in that direction. And I also, it's really, really hard to balance, but like, I don't love the monetization of all fan things except for, I mean, and I'm very hypocritical because I am paid to write about fandom, you know, so like, I don't know what to say here. Maybe I shouldn't go down this road, but like, fan fiction is the only thing left that kind of remains in that space. And I hate that people have to treat the things that they love and want to do for the joy of the thing as like their side hustle, or like, this needs to be good enough so I can sell it. Like, I don't want to begrudge anyone the right to monetize their work, especially at a time like now where people are really short on cash. But I hope that we continue to preserve multiple paths so people can just treat it as an amateur pursuit. I say as a fan professional. So that's fine. My hypocritical answer.
But for me, I really am excited to see what the different platforms will bring to fandom, because although we've had some things with platforms changing where we're like, about it, and where it's more in the public eye, what I really have liked about TikTok specifically, hopefully we don't have it banned, is that there's this really cool combination of almost like cosplay and fanfic that happens there in like a one-shot format with sound, which is like a whole thing that they like amalgamate into one thing, which I think is really cool. And you really can't do that on another platform. Again, you could make like, I guess, YouTube videos, but not really, because this allows other fans to interact with people's videos and create their own stories. So one video can spawn 14 different stories because of the people duetting it. And I think that's really cool for people to do either cosplay of like actual canon stuff or like original kind of works and stuff and characters as well. So that's what I'm excited for. Although there is some stuff about Twitter, especially about a platform, I am excited to see what they do with the other platforms as we get more. So we did have a question from Samantha Potts asking, when should a trope be criticized and how should we speak about those criticisms? And I think this is an interesting question because I think that there's going to be different answers based on if you're coming to it from a fandom side of things versus like a canon mainstream side of things.
I think one... Sorry, Elizabeth.
Oh, no, I just wanted to clarify the question. Is this about the actual trope itself or...
I'm not sure what they were
open for interpretation.
Open for interpretation.
Okay,
out live.
You tell me how you're interpreting it.
I don't know. I was going to say. All I was going to say was that if the question is just when should a trope be criticized, tropes are not neutral, obviously. So there are some tropes which, for all we've talked about, storytelling and the purposes of narrative, there are definitely some tropes that we should retire forever and never speak of again. Like exoticizing tropes, like tropes that rest in like racist assumptions of what people are like, that kind of thing. That's a very good reason for a trope to be criticized and, forcefully retired. Other than that, I'm not really sure how to answer the question.
I think you got to be able to distinguish between like, is this trope, do I not like this trope because it's based in something just fundamentally wrong, or do I just not like this trope because it doesn't work for me?
Exactly.
Because just because it doesn't work for you doesn't mean that the trope's bad. Like, and I think part of that too is just being honest about your taste and what you want from a story, right? And it's just like, because I think sometimes, especially in Twitter, since that got brought up, is that space can get a little self-righteous, and it's like what I like is right and everything else is wrong. And it's like, you gotta be able to distinguish and also understand too, is it the trope that's bothering you or is it the craft behind the trope? Like, because it may not be the trope, it may just be it was the badly told story. So I think it's about examining yourself first and figuring out like exactly why this is bothering you.
Yeah, I mean, to that end, I would say that part of the problem with fan fiction is that the norms have shifted so much that there isn't actually a lot of space for critique of individual stories. And so then you wind up having to critique a whole entire trope, whereas there can be a lot of variation about how it's executed. And obviously, a racist exoticizing trope is always going to be racist, no matter how it's executed, right? And that's always, always right for critique. But when I think about it as a literary critic, which is like the other journalistic hat that I have, like if a book engages with a trope, like that's always open for criticism, right? Like it's just like the critique should never be it's tropey, right? Like exactly, right. Like that's not useful in any way. But if you feel like if you say like I don't know, if there are so many like there's so many tropes within older genres that are like really misogynistic, right? And you can say it can feel like a familiar arc that you understand, and you can say like, well, it's 2020, let's talk, like I'm going to critique this, right? But I think that would come hand in hand with just critiquing the work in general, the form that it's choosing or the arcs that it's choosing to follow, So I'd say it's always up for, but yeah, sorry, I trail off awkwardly at the end here. Do you think
Sam freeze on this?
I think Sam is
frozen. Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah.
You guys got any questions for each other?
Well, I guess so are you guys like looking, where do y'all mostly look at fandom stuff? Is it like on Instagram, Twitter? Or somewhere? Oh, there she is. There you go, Sam.
I was so ready to answer the question.
My
Uh-oh.
Oh dear.
Maybe we should just circle back to the question.
Keep talking. Right. Yeah.
So I see a lot of stuff on IG I like now. So I don't know if you guys are like on IG looking at stuff.
I still use Tumblr in the year of our Lord 2020. So, yeah.
Tumblr's a different space than it used to be. I feel like a lot of stuff went to Twitter, and now Tumblr's like
it's evolved into something interesting in the last year, I would say. It's way more active than it was a year ago, which is interesting to see. But there's way less discourse than there was because everyone went to Twitter to do the discoursing. So
right, and now Twitter is like not a great place for discoursing.
No.
So there was another really good question. I think this will have to be our last one. It just jumped, so now I couldn't. There we go. From Mariana, how do you guys feel about fandoms having an impact on how canon stories progress?
That's a good question. I was talking about this on a fan fiction panel I had yesterday, actually. I in particular, I think authors or whoever creators should try to create an organic, healthy relationship with their fandoms. It really gets under my skin when I see a creator who almost has an antagonistic relationship with their fans. And it's like, oh, you like this character? I'm going to put them through horrible, awful things that you'll hate. Or like, oh, you like this ship? I'm going to break it up. And it's like, and it's obvious that it's not done to service the story. It's just to throw a middle finger to your fans. And it's like, that's just so, I hate it. And I think, there's got to be a balance between, am I telling the best story I can, and also like making sure that like my fans will appreciate this and we have this symbiotic, healthy relationship. And I feel like, you definitely don't want to go too far the other way because you'll never make anybody happy. You still have to be true to yourself as a creator. But I do think that I don't think it's a bad thing to think about your fandom. Like, I don't think it's an unhealthy thing to think about, will this affect my fans? Or like, yeah, I think creating a healthy relationship is the way to go.
I think that I think you have to respect your fans as, engaged participants with your work, which isn't necessarily the same as giving them what they want. I think starting from a position of you're never going to give everybody what they want, for one thing, but I think I think sometimes storytelling is giving people what they didn't know they wanted. So there's that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you're both saying, having observed the course of fan-creator interaction over the last decade, I think we're in a worse place than we've ever been. It's my very pessimistic thing to say at the end here. I'm thinking specifically of that quote from the writer's room of The Dragon Prince. I don't know if you guys saw this, where they said that they were so worried about fan reactions to interactions between characters that they always were thinking of fans as they were writing, and they made sure to not throw in too much shipping oil, which I guess was like subtext between characters that they didn't think that people should be shipping, and like that's really depressing that that's where we're at right now, is that people are constantly thinking of like a mob of angry fans as they write out these shows. That's not good writing to me, but I also have a lot of sympathy for the position that they feel like they are in now, and potentially this position they are in, So like, I think I absolutely agree with both of you that I think that as a critic and as a writer, like I think that people should write the best story, and it's not necessarily servicing anyone but the story, right? But I also don't know how to stop the kind of the kind of toxic dynamics that are going on right now, and the fear that writers' rooms or studios in particular are responding to. If you look at something, not to like go into specifics, but like if you look at the last Star Wars movie, it was so clearly created from a place of fear about backlash, and I think that dramatically affected the story they told. And that sucks. It's going to make a worse story for everyone, including the people making it, So, sorry, it's depressing.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, where I feel like we're at this point that we haven't really been before, where both sides of the coin have access to each other, like an overabundance of access. So then they're overly aware of each other and overly involved in each other. Like there's a lot of good things where we have more access to authors and screenwriters and things like that, but also there's this level of like, I almost wish that we didn't have access to them anymore, because I don't want us to be so involved, because you do have that. I mean, I'm thinking like Game of Thrones finale, where it was like, well, we did this to shock you because we knew what the fans like were saying, and it's like, well, then you're not actually even writing a good story if you're letting us affect you that much. You're not even thinking about what's actually going to, like you said, serve the story more. So I hope that we get to a place of balance in the future. That's what I hope in general, but at this point, yeah, I feel like we're too enmeshed right now with each other. So, well, we are at a little bit over an hour. I could talk to you guys for like a whole other hour about fandom stuff. So it was a wonderful joy to talk to all of you for the last hour. For everyone that's watching, this will be staying up on my channel, so you'll get to watch it later if you didn't catch us live. And all of these wonderful creators' information will be down below in the description box, so you can access them and hear their wonderful thoughts all the time. So thanks everyone for joining us, and have a good rest of your weekend.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.